we'll get to. Great. Well, let's begin anyway. Hear God's word. As we face yet another lockdown, we need some help from God. We've just prayed and asked for help from God, haven't we? We're all going through a tough time. Our family is in quarantine because of someone at Tim's school. And all of us need to know that God is there, that God loves us, that God is in control, that God cares. That's an important message, isn't it? But at the same time, we need to keep living for God and obeying Him. There are lots of things we can't do in lockdown, but we still need to keep obeying God, living for God. On the one hand, we need to rest and trust in God and receive His help in difficult times. On the other hand, we're not to give up. We're to hang in there. We're to keep on doing our best to live for God. We're going to be looking at the book of Judges in the Bible over the next few weeks. And as we begin Judges, the author Tim Keller has a helpful observation. He says, Judges assumes God's unconditional promises that He made to His people. That's like the comfort that we look to receive from God, God's unconditional promises. I will be your God and you will be my people. I will always be with you no matter what you do. Promises from God. And he says to them, particularly in Judges and Joshua, I will give you the land. But Judges also contains God's conditional commands. You obey me, God says, and I will bless you. If you don't obey me, then you'll be cursed. If you obey me, you will live long in the land. If you don't, you'll be cast out. They're conditional promises. You do this, then I'll do this. So the question is, what is it? We've got two things going on here. Will God keep His unconditional promises regardless, or can people break God's conditional promises? How does that work? How do the two go together? Are God's promises to us of blessing and peace, are they conditional? Do we need to be good? Do we need to do things to earn those promises? Or can the people break God's conditional promises? Are God's promises to us of blessing and peace conditional on our obedience or unconditional? And the answer is that neither is right. Both are true. Neither are fully true. And this tension accompanies us all the way through the Bible. God's unconditional promises, His conditional promises. How do they work together? We won't get to the final answer to that question until we get to Jesus, and in particular, Jesus on the cross. And we'll certainly be jumping ahead to Jesus at different points as we're working our way through Judges. But before we get to Judges, we need the background that's found in the book of Joshua. And Joshua comes before Judges in the Bible. The first verse of Judges says, after the death of Joshua, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord. So today we're going to fill in that background from Joshua chapter 23. The last chapter of Joshua was read for us by Catherine. You probably didn't get to that on the video, sorry about that. But if you have a Bible, you can open it up or find the Bible online, and I'll read some of the verses to you. I want us to see a simple pattern that will help us as we read Judges, and it's there in Joshua, and actually it's there in the whole Bible as well. First, looking back like that way, I guess. In Joshua 23 verse 1 we read, a long time afterwards, when the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their surrounding enemies. Then verse 3, and you have seen all that the Lord your God has done. The writer wants them to look back to see what God has already done for His people. He's already given them rest from their surrounding enemies. Now, we will come to the question, a tricky question of war in the Bible. Not today, but we'll get to that in another sermon. all of the stories in the Bible, my story, your story, always start with what God has done, all the way back to creation. God always acts first. Looking back, that's our first point. The second part of the pattern is looking forward. Looking forward, I'm looking forward to you. Maybe try that side. In verses 4 and 5 of Joshua 23, God makes a promise for what he will do, looking forward. He says that he has already allotted them a place in the land, and he will push back their enemies before, just as he promised. And you've got forward, backwards and forwards, haven't you? God promised, and so he will do this. That's really important. See, what God is doing here is he reminds them of his track record, his reliability. That's what we want to know. Tim recently bought a used car. We want to know about his history, if it's any good or not. And then God makes a promise to them. God reassures them that just like he was in the past, in the future, he will be with them. He will give them the land. But it doesn't stop there. The third part of the pattern is we've kind of got looking back and looking forward. And then we've got right in the middle, where we are right now. God asks them, God asks you and me to respond in obedience. He shows them what he's done, he tells them what he will do, and then he asks them to respond. There's the pattern right there. And that works all the way through the Bible. It's a key, if you like, to understanding pretty much all the Bible. Our God is great. He provides, he saves, he makes promises, but he does make demands of us. He calls us to respond. How do we respond? Verse 6 of Joshua 23, therefore, be very strong to keep and do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, turning aside from it, neither to the right hand nor to the left. They need to obey. They need to do what God tells them. They're not to follow other gods. They are to be loyal to God alone. And we'll see that coming up in Judges over and over. Perhaps the fourth part of the cycle, if you like, and it's kind of in the middle as well, is God reassures them of his help. He points them to what he's done. He tells them what he's going to do. He asks them to respond, and he assures them of his help. Look at verse 8 in Joshua 23. But you shall cling to the Lord your God. I love that word. Cling to the Lord your God, just as you have done to this day. And then God, after God has made it clear what he expects from them, he reassures and he reminds them in verse 9. For the Lord has driven out before you great and strong nations. As for you, no one has been able to stand before you to this day. In this verse here, Joshua 23 verse 9, we see this mixture of God's work and their work. God is going to do it for them. In fact, he's already done it for them. But they are going to participate. They have already achieved much with God's help. No one has been able to stand before you. Not because they're strong, but because the Lord has driven out the great and strong nations. They're not going to do it by themselves in their own limited strength. That never works. And in verse 10, we see the same thing in reverse order. One of you puts to flight 1,000. Wow, aren't they good? Since it is the Lord your God who fights for you, just as he promised you. Look at what they can do. One puts fight to 1,000, but it's only because God fights for them, just as he promised. And in verses 11 to 13, we have God's conditional promise. Be very careful, therefore, to love the Lord your God, for if you turn back, know for certain the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you. Now, I'm going to skip back briefly to Joshua chapter 1, which puts it slightly differently. And Colin's song, Strong and Courageous, comes from this chapter. There's much less of a conditional feel Let's have a quick look at Joshua 1. Now, therefore, from verse 2, go over the Jordan, this is what they have to do, into the land I'm giving you. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, just as I gave to Moses. What he's done before. So therefore, do what I'm telling you now. No one shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life, just as I was with Moses. He tells them again, in the space of 2 verses almost. I will be with you, just as I was with. I will not leave you or forsake you. So be strong and courageous. And on it goes from verses 7 to 9. I'll skip that for now, but you can look that up yourself. This is the summary. I am with you, says God. I will give you victory. So therefore fight. If we know that God is going to be with us, we've got nothing to lose, have we? Be strong and courageous. Not because you are strong and courageous, but because I, God, will give you strength. Because I will go with you wherever you go. Why should they obey? Why should they be strong and courageous? So that God will bless them, so that they'll win God's favour. Actually, they already have God's favour. They already have his blessing. Blessing here doesn't follow obedience, but here the blessing is because of God's promise. Tim Keller calls this promise-relying obedience. Promise, we obey because we rely on God's promise, not to kind of make the promise happen, as it were. Where do we find courage? Do we find courage in the fact that maybe you're strong, you're a good person, you're naturally optimistic, you have some kind of courage, self-confident? It doesn't really work for me. No, we have courage because we know that God is with us. How do we know that God is with us? That he will be with us, especially when we don't feel like it. We don't actually feel God's presence sometimes, especially during COVID lockdown. When you're sick, when someone you love is sick, and we have people in the congregation in those exact positions. How do we know? Because of God's promise. How do we know that God will keep his promise? Because that is what God does. God is a promise-keeping God. A covenant-keeping God is the biblical language that's used. That's what the Old Testament is all about. It's the Old Testament, the Old Covenant. It's God's covenant, God's promise to his people. And the New Testament is a new covenant. The Bible is all about God's promise. That's how we describe it. The new and the old promise. Showing us over and over again, God keeps his promises, even when we don't keep our end of the bargain, when we don't keep our promises. Often when we don't keep our end of the bargain, and especially when we don't keep our end of the bargain. And that's what Jesus is all about. If you want an easy way to understand Jesus, Jesus shows us that God keeps his promises. We're about to celebrate the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper, during that I will say the words, this is my blood of the new covenant, words of Jesus. The new promise is about God's forgiveness and salvation in Jesus. Communion reminds us and strengthens our faith as we remember what God has done for us. We look back to not just to the Old Testament, but to what God has done for us in Jesus. Tim Keller says, God's call to his people, both then, Joshua and the judges, and now to us, is to combine spirituality with bravery. Spiritual bravery. Spirituality, trusting God. Bravery, stepping out and trying hard with all our energy. When we trust God, we rely on him to keep his promises, to bless us, to be with us. It can be hard to trust in God because we don't rely on ourselves, on our own instincts, which is what we're used to doing. We don't rely on our own plans, what we think might work. Again, Tim Keller says, it is hard to be truly brave without faith in God. You see, bravery, true bravery, doesn't come from trying to prove ourselves or some kind of self-confidence or needing to have big muscles or lots of arrogance. That's not bravery, what we might see in the movies so often. Where does our strength and bravery come from? When we feel exhausted, when we're depressed from yet another lockdown, more sickness and problems. True bravery, spiritual bravery, gets its strength and confidence from God. Sometimes true bravery, spiritual bravery, gets its strength and confidence from God. Sometimes I feel brave and confident when the sun is shining. Almost, there's a few clouds out there. When I'm out on a run, a jog, when someone said something nice to me, feeling confident. Other times, I don't feel brave at all when the clouds come over, when it's dark and raining. When I get bad news, yet another lockdown. When I'm feeling hungry. When my good idea doesn't work or someone has criticised me. I don't feel brave at all. Just think if my bravery depended on me. That means it depends on the weather or with what I ate agrees with me or not. Whether I've got a tummy ache or whether I'm on a sugar high or a caffeine high or had a few drinks and a bit brave that way. Whether people like me or not. It's not really going to work, is it? But if my bravery depends on God, God doesn't change no matter what the weather is or how I'm feeling or what I ate or drank or what other people say or think of me. Trusting God doesn't make me weak and dependent, but rather strengthens me and gives me the courage to serve God. Well, over the month of August, St. John's are going to take some time for prayer and reflection for us to think about our future. Now, if you were to ask me to make a plan, I don't think this is the best time to be doing this. I think it's actually hard to think creatively and confidently about the future right now, day 3 of lockdown, whatever it is. But the point is, this isn't about our good ideas or how confident we are to make big visionary plans for the future. I don't have much energy for that at the moment. I don't know who does. But what about if together, we, the people of St. John's, called out to God, we got on our knees, even when we're not feeling strong, actually when we're feeling quite weak, when we don't have many good ideas, when we can't see very positively into the future. What about if our courage and our strength came from God and not from us? You'll hear more about our plans and what we hope to do, but hopefully we'll do lots of praying. And I'm going to pray now, and this will also be our time of prayer. I'm going to take some prayers from Joshua chapter 1.